Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and welcome to part 3 of our voyage through Asian horror films released during 2007. I enjoyed all of the films we are reviewing this evening, to a greater or lesser degree. Most of these movies are actually ghost films, or have ghosts in them. But keep that in mind because we have some variety here in terms of country of origin, time periods and settings, the characteristics and behavior of these particular ghosts, overall tone, themes, and cultural value as well. I will point out some of these differences as we go through the movies tonight, but keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. Also, there are some movies that I covered in parts 1 and 2 that some people prefer over some of the films that I'm covering tonight. I know that there are fans of, for example, The Butcher, or Evil Twin, or Body 19. So you may disagree with me on some of my recommended choices for this evening, but that's one of the things that makes movie watching so interesting, right? And as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. So the first film tonight is from Thailand, and that is called Ghost Mother. When a mother leaves her 3 children and the father suddenly dies of unknown causes, Nuntha has to take care of her niece and nephews. To earn money to support the children, she sells soya milk and fried donuts in the morning. So this woman works hard because of the love she has for these kids. Unfortunately, her dead brother worked as an undercover agent to gather evidence against powerful criminals, and she is, unfortunately, misunderstood to be a fellow agent of his. So, as you might expect, she is subsequently murdered by these criminals, but that does not stop her from returning as a ghost to continue to care for these children as a supernatural being. Now, this is one of those flicks where the ghost is the protagonist, and the humans are kind of a mix of friends and foes. Some of the more friendly humans include not only the children, but the woman's friend, lady friend, I guess, as well as an honest cop who is investigating the murders. This movie is kind of at the bottom of this video, so to speak, because there's nothing really particularly great about it, and it does have some flaws. For example, the opening 10 minutes of this film are scattershot, rushed, and a little bit difficult to follow. Jumps around a lot. The antagonists are all undeveloped gangster types. They're all pretty thin caricatures. But you will notice at least 2 of them, the actors I should say, from some fairly recent Thai action films if you follow Thai action. So that was kind of interesting to see a few of those guys who play bad guys in Thai action films also play bad guys in this Thai horror film. None of the horror scenes are really that scary, and that's primarily because the ghost is the protagonist here, so it's kind of a given. But with that said, I do think that Ghost Mother has its positives. The conflict is simplistic, but affecting, especially when the protagonist is murdered. There are some decent death sequences, like the construction scene accidents near the end that I liked. And there is some effective melodrama with the kids. In a nutshell, I do not think that this film is of a particularly high quality or anything, but I do think its heart is in the right place, and I found it watchable. I also know quite a few people who like it more than I do, so take that as you will. Now, availability of Ghost Mother is that it is difficult to find, but there is a Malaysian DVD with English subtitles floating around. It's also available on YouTube. Okay, our next film here is another one that's, not particularly great in quality, but I thought was kind of interesting. And that is Dead Air from Hong Kong. A television show director stumbles upon the corpse of a pregnant woman while he's driving, and he calls for help. Later on, the ghost of the woman returns to him and offers him a favor in exchange for saving the child's life. So the director promptly uses her to manipulate people to participate in this new TV show that he's developing, where contestants attempt suicide for cash prizes if they survive. So this is a decently fun movie, I thought, due to its brisk pacing and some unorthodox moments. It definitely gets some entertainment value out of its premise, which is quite different and offers the opportunity for some variety in the character interaction. there's some humor peppered in at times, but it's more of the laid-back variety and mostly avoids any like slapstick wackiness, you know? Similar to Ghost Mother, actually, the scares are light because the ghost is the protagonist. Although this one has a slightly deeper edge to it, I'll say. There is a little bit room for a darker side in this movie, I think, because the protagonist, Ghost, has a slightly darker persona than the ghost in Ghost Mother. And you kind of wonder at times if she's trustworthy or maybe has an ulterior motive. And you find out later if that's true or not. So that was kind of an interesting little nuance, I thought. A few scenes do come off as kind of hokey and cheesy, but I thought this one was a decent time waster. It's alright, pretty good. Now, availability of dead air is that it is, well, difficult to find, unfortunately. I remember I watched this on a DVD, or I used a DVD service that no longer exists. I think this was an e-hit rental for me. And they are no longer around. So I'm not sure where you could get it if you wanted, but not one to really seek out or spend much time seeking out. But if you come across it, you got some time in the evening, pop it in or give it a whirl. Now our next two films I liked more than our last two, and they are both from Indonesia, actually. They both have their flaws, but I do like them a little bit more. So, like the previous films, or the previous videos in this playlist, we're, slowly increasing in quality as we go along these parts. And this next film is called Kuntilanak 2, of course, from Indonesia. Now, this is a sequel to the surprisingly entertaining original film, and it is a follow-up, which means that we have the same protagonist. So, after the events of the first film, this girl moves out of the old haunted boarding house, escaping from followers of a particular sect who seek revenge over the death of the landlady. Her boyfriend also returns and starts looking for her. So she finds a new residence here in an attempt to regroup and deal with her own dark side. If you remember, she has a curse of sorts that takes control of her, beyond her control, really, and she ends up using a deadly chant to essentially kill other people. Now, the menace within this girl is raised stronger and stronger. She cannot stop herself from chanting the cursed chant to bring deadly punishments to those around her. So her boyfriend shows up and really tries to rein her in. Bring her back to a pure conscience, so to speak, before the curse takes over her life completely. So our protagonist is definitely losing control of things in this, and she straight up just kills a dude near the beginning of the movie, who really did not deserve to die. So I found that kind of an interesting moment, because you have a protagonist who just straight up murders a dude at the beginning, so that was pretty cool. When I reviewed the first Kuntilanak film, I mentioned that the lead actress, Julie Estelle, would go on to later appear as Hammer Girl in The Raid 2, released in 2014. Thankfully, she did return for Kuntilanak 2 in the lead role, and she still holds the screen well. In addition, the atmosphere is good and the lighting is effective in this, which should be no surprise given its predecessor. In fact, Kuntilanak 2 actually starts off very well, with some grammar school kids who are exploring the abandoned location, I believe, from the first film. It's a nice, 9-minute short intro that acts almost like a short film that continues to establish the themes of the original before the plot of Kuntilanak 2 officially kicks off. Kind of an interesting way to start the film, I think, and I think it works. There's a lot of horror in Kuntilanak 2, which is a good thing here. The ghost designs are freaky in the Indonesian style. We covered one or two Indonesian films from our previous video where, you had the ghostly premise, but it didn't use the Indonesian style ghost. They just piggybacked off of the Japanese onryo. You don't have to worry about that here with Kuntilanak 2. They use the freaky-looking Indonesian ghosts, which I always like to see. And one thing I forgot to mention when I was reviewing Kuntilanak is that the director is a man named Rizal Mantovani. He directed all 3 films in this Kuntilanak trilogy, as well as a number of other Indonesian films. And I've only been able to see a few of the other ones, because Indonesian films are hard to find in the West. But he has made a name for himself in his home country, and it's nice to see that consistency at director in this trilogy. Now, I've had quite a few positive things to say about Kuntilanak 2 so far, but there are a few negatives that hurt this film's overall quality. Unfortunately, some of the acting by the supporting characters is pretty bad. It gets pretty bad for the supporting characters. Some very bad performances in this, and that gives the film a schlocky feel at times. You'll have stretches in this movie where it feels classy, so to speak, and good quality. And then some of the side characters, mostly the human antagonists, are the ones that just don't really nail it. You know what I mean? They're kind of cheesy when they show up. There's also an eventual shift towards a human threat that does not work quite as well as a supernatural threat. So there is a certain disappointment regarding the finale to this film, but it's still pretty good. I would say that if you've seen and enjoyed the first Kuntilanak film, give this one a shot. It's a pretty good flick. I enjoyed it more after a second viewing because I think I got over some of the uneven performances during my second viewing. And you do need to watch these films in order. I tell you a lot of times, for like the Whispering Corridor series, you can watch them in any order. For the Kuntilanak trilogy, you really need to watch them in order. DVD availability for this one. Difficult to find. Bad luck tonight for availability. The Malaysian DVD for this one is out of print, unfortunately, but this is available on YouTube without subtitles. Alright, our next Indonesian film tonight is one that very few people know about. That's why I'm here, to tell you about movies like this. And that is Angkerbatu. A Korean company wants to convert the Angkerbatu forest into the largest golf course in Asia. But the people who live near the forest are trying to stop this corporation because they believe that the area is cursed. So during the negotiations, a Korean reporter and his cameraman mysteriously disappears in Indonesia while they were in the midst of covering the story about Angkerbatu. Now, after their disappearance, a producer and his team travels there to find them, but when they arrive, not only are their colleagues gone, but most of the village has mysteriously disappeared. So this movie has some good atmosphere throughout, especially when the protagonists travel the abandoned streets and buildings in this area. One scene in an abandoned supermarket is kind of creepy. The sheer absence of any and all humanity within an urban area is very chilling. We saw some of that at the end of Pulse, the Japanese horror film from 2001. You get a little bit of that in Angkerbatu, mostly near the beginning. The lighting of the night scenes is effective. I like the lighting in this. Not too dark, but dark enough to be creepy. The main actors are pretty good, but some of the supporting actors give uneven performances. This seems to be a case, not all the time, for Indonesian horror films, but just seems like sometimes the supporting actors that they get just really cannot hold their own. But since they're supporting actors, they're not on screen too much. You can usually deal with it. I did feel like some of the screaming in this movie felt a bit off. Some of the acting when the supporting actors were screaming it didn't feel convincing, No scream queens in this one, unfortunately. There are quite a few ghost hauntings, a nice chunk of horror-related content in this. They are reasonably well executed and relatively fun to watch. One reason for this is that there is a lot of energy and a lot of horror to the film, which keeps things moving and helps to hold your attention. The finale is a little bit different from what you might expect, if only because so many people are running for their lives. So really, like the first half of this movie, there are very few people in this village, but as things progress, you get to see, a finale where there is more people present than when you might expect. I found that kind of interesting. Usually it's the opposite, where you have a lot of people at the beginning of a horror film. They either run away or get killed, and then you only have like one or two at the end. This is the opposite, which I thought was pretty cool. So Angkerbatu, as you may expect, is difficult to find, but it is on YouTube without subs. Alright, so we move back to Thailand. A lot of Southeast Asian coverage in this video, isn't it? Well, that's what we're doing here. And that is The Haunted Drum, also known as Perng Mang. Alright, we're in Thailand, remember? So set in a rural village, a group of young men take an oath to dedicate their lives to a band that plays traditional Thai music. But this responsibility is a difficult one because the training is very hard and the lifestyle is in poverty. These dilemmas are exacerbated by an arrogant musician who attempts to break up the band for his own advantage, as well as a supernatural aspect to the instruments, which could end in much death. This movie is heavily driven by the human conflict, which creates the possibility of betrayal between the characters and a gateway for the ghostly deaths. Because, this is one of those films where the human conflict and drama is what drives the horror. The horror isn't thrown in just for the sake of it, so that's good. Script focuses a lot on the story, works well. There is also a romantic subplot, but much of the conflict is in the form of the rivalry between the music teachers and their students. The setting of kind of the rural village is, it offers much in terms of authentic Thai culture and music. There is some music that's played using these instruments, and that's interesting to see in a horror film. Horror scenes are creative for the most part. They're a little different and moderately violent, with an emphasis on twisted body parts and self-mutilation. So, this is, again, a little bit different from a typical Thai horror film that you might see that involves the supernatural. And it has that cultural aspect to it. So I like this one, The Haunted Drum. Again, it's a film that has its heart in the right place. Again, unfortunately, bad luck tonight. Difficult to find, but it is on YouTube with subtitles. Well, that's good. Alright, I promise we're going to get to some more available films soon. Just got to take what we can get sometimes. Alright, so our next film here is from mainland China. I believe it's from mainland China. A lot of times the Chinese language horror films that we cover are from Hong Kong. This one's from the mainland, and that is The Matrimony. This is a horror romance hybrid. It's set during the 1930s, which is an interesting time period for horror. This movie follows a cinematographer who is deeply in love with his girlfriend. Now, due to his extremely introverted character, he's unable to confess to her how deeply he cares for her. But when she dies in a freak car accident on the way to their date, he mourns her deeply. His mother manages to convince him later on to marry another woman, but he is unwilling to allow her to take the place in his heart that is reserved for his first love. But the girlfriend's ghost grows dangerously jealous when the new couple grow closer. This is a good quality flick, and it's enjoyable and develops relationships between the characters very nicely. This has a pretty good romantic foundation to it. Leon Lai is quite good in the lead role. You may have recognized him in films such as Bodyguards and Assassins, Seven Swords, Heroic Duo, and Fallen Angels. Fan Bingbing plays the ghost, and I'm sure you've seen her before. She was in My Way, Shaolin, Flashpoint, and she was also in a few Hollywood productions as like a side character. For example, she was in X-Men Days of Future Past. So we do have a good cast here that is pretty well known. The scares are on the light side, but the ghost is shown in a very stylish, humanized fashion here. The time period and setting add to the experience. We have a lot of films tonight that have some good cultural value to it, some good dramatic foundations to them, and have different types of settings to them that really add to the experience. And in my last video, I said that the Korean film Evil Twin felt a little bit gimmicky, right? Because the time period didn't feel like it was really fully utilized, and the horror elements were too modern and cliched, which kind of created an inconsistency there. But The Matrimony mostly avoids that problem, I think, because the time period and setting of the 1930s feels more organic and consistent with the horror elements, which is executed in a more traditional classic style. And consequently, the atmosphere is also very good in spots. So this is nice. Now, in terms of flaws, the themes and the content overall is pretty, on the nose, so to speak. It's not particularly subtle in its themes, but they're still fairly well executed, I think. So this movie is a fine experience regardless of its flaws. I enjoyed it. The Matrimony. And luckily, The Matrimony is moderately available on DVD. It did get a wide US DVD release, but it seems to be phasing out a little bit. But you can still find it fairly easily. Alright, we're going to mix it up here, people. We're going to mix it up. Our next film is one of the weirdest vampire films of the last 20 years. I didn't even know this movie existed until 4 years after it was made, or longer than that. I don't remember when I saw this, but it came out in its home country in 2007. I didn't even know it existed until like 2012 or something. And that is Sanguivorous, also known as Kyuketsu, from Japan. Always can count on Japan for a weird one, can't we? Now, this is a mostly black and white, mostly silent, avant-garde film about a young woman and her boyfriend who cross paths with a duo of vampires. The official plot synopsis goes something like this, okay? A young woman suffering from mysterious physical ailments is horrified to discover that she's descended from generations of vampires. With her boyfriend, she struggles to control her peculiar appetite, but it's in her blood. Now, the big highlights here are the visuals, all right, which are expressed by a stark contrast between light and shadows, as well as grainy film stock effects, which are pretty creepy. It gives the feel of like the horror classics of the 1930s, which is definitely cool for a modern film. There's also some very good use of sound in this, with some creepy noises and ambient noise. Glacial pacing contributes to a highly atmospheric movie. This is not a film really that focuses much at all on story or character development, opting instead to kind of transport the viewer on a journey into another reality of sorts. It feels like you're in another reality, really. I think it does a good job of doing this. Sanguivorous could be considered an experimental film. It's pretty weird stuff, but it is mostly easy to follow, I think, at least on a high level. I mean, there are some specific moments that are somewhat perplexing. I gotta tell you that. For example, there's actually an appearance by a renowned Buto dancer in real life named Ko Murobushi, who performs a very bizarre, like, convulsion sequence in the middle of the film. So this is one of those flicks where it's like, it's pretty weird, but I think it's engaging and intriguing in its weirdness, because there's some weird movies that just irritate you. This one intrigued me. It's only 56 minutes long. Not for mainstream viewers, though. I would definitely recommend that you watch the 4-minute trailer on YouTube, which will give you a good idea of whether or not you're going to like this. If you watch that 4-minute trailer and you really like it, check the movie out. So that'll be kind of the test for you. I personally dug this because it's something very different, and the execution is good enough to hold my interest. I suspect if I were to watch this a second time, and I have it in my DVD collection, so I probably will, I would probably like it even more. You know, because when you watch a really weird movie, sometimes you're just like in shock at what you're seeing, and it'd probably take repeat viewings to really dig into everything. There's no, this isn't like Tetsuo the Iron Man in terms of excessive violence and in-your-face stuff. This is more like a creepy one, you know what I mean? So, and Sanguivorous, unbelievably, for a film this obscure, is widely available on DVD in the United States. Unbelievable, but that's true. Alright, so our next two films tonight, we are, like I said, we're getting a decent variety here. A lot of these are ghost films, but they're quite different from one another. Our next two are from Japan. One is a samurai era horror film, so it's a throwback to those films, and the one after that is like a rural village horror film. Kind of like one or two of the Thai ones that we just covered. It's always nice to see those, because a lot of horror films nowadays seem to take place in cities and stuff like that. Nice to see them break out into the wilderness. So the first one here is called Kaidan, a Japanese horror romance hybrid. This is set in the 19th century, and tells the story of a man who is cursed as an unfortunate result of his ancestor who murdered a debt collector. So this basically begins with an acupuncturist who lives with his daughters in a certain province in Japan. He saves some money, becomes a moneylender, and lends his money to a samurai. So 3 years later, he visits the samurai to collect his money, but the samurai kills him and dumps his body in the Kasane swamp, where bodies disappear and never return to the surface. However, before dying, the man curses the samurai, who promptly goes crazy and kills his wife. Then, the film switches, or I guess fast forwards to 25 years later. The samurai's son begins to bear his father's sins. So this film by Hideo Nakata, the man who directed Ringu and Dark Water, is an homage to the J-horror films of the 50s and 60s. You should be very familiar with those if you've seen the first few videos of this playlist. I covered a bunch of those. But this is not a remake of the 1964 film Kaidan. So, don't go in expecting that. It's not a remake, although it's still kind of a classical film, horror film, so to speak. Now, there are references to many of those classic films here, as expected, both in terms of plot as well as names. So, for example, you may recognize the term Kasane Swamp because we covered a few of the Kasane Swamp films in the first few videos of this playlist. One of which is actually had the term Kasane Swamp in the title, and I think there was one or two more that revolved around the swamp. So it's a pretty famous, area for Japanese horror mythology. Now, the cinematography, the set designs, and the lighting in Kaidan are very pleasing on the eyes, which should be no surprise. This director is good at that, you know what I mean? Well acted and slow paced, with the horror being portrayed in a thematic way instead of a visceral one. You know what I mean? These angry spirits use acts of deception instead of direct violence, which again, if you've seen any films from the 50s and 60s, you will have seen that a handful of times. The tone is also very romanticized and classical. It does a good job of setting up and developing the scenario. We stay with the main character throughout the entire film, actually, but the supporting characters come and go. This helps to communicate that the curse is not going away anytime soon, because cutting ties with people is not going to help this guy. Now, our main character moves from one romance to another fairly quickly, so that you kind of get the feeling of this guy. At first, you feel sorry for him, because he's bearing the brunt of his father's sins through this curse. But as the film progresses, he's a little dodgy. You're not really sure if you like this guy much. As the film goes along, there's a little bit of nuance there that I liked. He's not just a basic protagonist you're expected to like. So I thought that was pretty interesting. There's a very good sword fight near the end of this film, so that's something to look forward to. So I like this one. I mentioned before that the horror elements are there, but like I said, they're very thematic. There's not a whole lot of blood in this movie at all, or even like visceral ghost scenes where the ghost is like attacking someone. There's none of that here. The horror is very thematic and classical, so just so you know. This is the 5th installment in the J-Horror Theater film series, and is yet another good film. Every single one of the titles in this J-Horror Theater film series has been at least good, if not very good. And we have one left to review when we reach 2010, so look out for that. Alright, so what is the availability of Kaidan? Availability of Kaidan is that it is widely available on DVD. So our luck's changing here. A lot of these films that we're covering later in this video are easier to get. And you know what? I'm going to look up right now, because you're probably wondering about this J-Horror Theater. The prior films in this J-Horror Theater film series were, let's see here, Infection from 2004, Premonition from 2004, we got Reincarnation from 2005, we got Retribution from 2006, and then we just covered Kaidan from 2007. So that's the first 5 films in the series. and we'll cover the sixth and final one later. Alright, so our next film tonight. Next film tonight is called Twilight Phantom, also known as Ako-kuro. Another very obscure film, very few people know about, and this is Japanese, and it's quite good. So set in Okinawa this time, this film touches upon the Kijimura creature legend, small wood spirits that become violent when betrayed by humans. Now, our protagonist in this one is a young woman who has returned to Okinawa and interacts with the locals, who are having some intense personal conflicts. There is some significant animosity between one man and his ex-wife, and that really drives the fates for all the characters as the film progresses. This feels a bit different from a typical supernatural horror film, due mostly to its location and local folklore. The legend is detailed pretty early on in the film, but it is infused within a seemingly unrelated human conflict. At first you're like, well, how is this legend going to tie into this human conflict that I previously summarized? And it is interesting to spot the references to the Kijimuna throughout, because it is infused, let's put it that way. I like how the folklore includes a variety of stories, which gives this some realism, because many stories in real life involving folklore, including Japanese yokai monsters, have many different versions depending on which village it originated from, or it's etc. So that's nice. And there's a few different versions that are presented in this film of this particular legend. There is a good opening scene that I enjoyed that lets the viewer know that they will be in for something a little bit different. There's good introductions to the protagonists. One of the side characters is a priestess, and I liked her a lot. She's a young woman who is very level-headed, practical, and modern in her thinking, despite the fact that she's a priestess. So I really liked her. She gets a good amount of screen time, but I was kind of hoping she'd get more. She was very cool. This film nicely avoids jump scares in favor of moody chills and a few fairly intense acts of violence. Scoring and sound design are creepy. Some of the ghost scenes are actually pretty creepy in this. I know we're talking about a Kijimuna legend involving small wood spirits, but there's also a little bit of a ghostly phenomena going on here as well. And it's well executed. The one thing that's different in this film is the sound design, okay? This movie uses almost like a crescendo of volume in the score at times, and then it cuts to no sound when someone is getting haunted. So it works really well because it's similar. It has like a similar effect to a jump scare, but avoids the cheapness of that particular scare tactic. Kind of gave me the jitters. You know what I mean? So it's almost like it builds, and then all the sound falls out, and then the ghost appears. I like that. No Japanese Onryo ghosts here, so this film does avoid quite a few cliches, I will say that much. Now, DVD availability of Twilight Phantom, moderately available. I would do a Google search on it. You may be able to find some copies floating around. All right. What do we got here? We got 2 left tonight. 2 left. The first one here is Carved. Japanese horror film. Now, Japan offers a slasher of sorts when a woman returns from the grave armed with garden shears to kill children in a small town. So it's a great time in this Asian horror movie playlist, people. It's a great time because we finally get to talk about the Kuchisake Onna legend. Yes, one of my favorite urban legends in Japan. Also known as the Slit-Mouthed Woman. Now, there are a few variations in the story, but the basic gist is that this woman was murdered by her husband at one point, who slit her mouth ear to ear. Of course, she returned as a vengeful ghost. Anybody would get angry after that happens to him. She basically walks the streets, sometimes in broad daylight, with a surgical mask on her face. When she finds a potential victim, she asks them, "Am I pretty?" So if you say no to this, she kills you right on the spot. If you say yes, suck up to her a little bit, she takes her mask off, showing her slit mouth, and asks again, "Am I pretty?" Now, if you backtrack on that and say no, she kills you, of course. But if you say yes again, she'll slit your mouth to look like hers. So, sounds like a no-win scenario, doesn't it? And it basically is. If you try to outrun her, you figure, I could probably outrun Sadako. I'll just outrun the slit-mouth woman, too. No, can't do it. You're in for a big surprise because she moves far faster than any human being ever could. The very informative book, Yokai Attack, the Japanese Monster Survival Guide, which I highly recommend, by the way, documents that the slit-mouthed woman has been said to run as fast as 100 yards in 3 seconds. You're not running away from this woman, so that's not an option. Most ironically, though, it is said that the best chance of escape from this woman is for the potential victim to answer her questions with ambiguities. So you might be able to BS your way out of it and confuse her. Because if she doesn't get a yes or a no answer to her questions, if you can word it in a confusing way, she might be so confused that you could just walk away and she's almost like stunned. And you could walk to safety. Another pointer is that if you have some candies with you, some Japanese sweets, just throw them on the ground in front of her, and if she likes that particular candy, she might be distracted long enough for you to get out. So both of those things are really the only ways out, from what I've heard. Another interesting real-life incident, before we get to the actual movie, that is associated with this legend is that during the late 1970s, there was a panic, a real-life panic, that spread across many towns in Japan because people were reporting that they actually saw a masked woman with like a surgical mask stalking children. So some of the schools they basically forced the children to walk home in groups or with teachers for a time. So that's pretty crazy. Yes, a slit-mouthed woman. So this movie, Carved, comes into play because it focuses on what appears to be the spirit's favorite victims. Grammar school kids. This thing is merciless. And if I remember correctly, she does indeed murder a handful of children in this movie. Bloody violence is shown very briefly at times, but the most disturbing moments are implied, and they are effective. Villain's creepy. She's a creepy lady. There's a nuance involving a human coughing sound that gave me the chills. I won't tell you how it's implemented, but anytime somebody coughs now, I hear somebody cough, I'm like, eh. The villain in this is a major reason of why this movie works. She's good. And she distinguishes herself from like Sadako or Kayako or any of those characters. Our main character in this movie is actually a teacher who investigates the legend and attempts to stop it before it claims the lives of more children. Now, the lead actress here is Eriko Sato, who is one of the most beautiful women on the planet. She previously starred in the comedy action film Cutie Honey, which is a very silly movie, but fairly entertaining. So I was a little bit apprehensive going into this one because I wasn't sure if she could pull off a horror film. But she does a good job here. And she does an even better job in her next film, the drama comedy Funuke Show Me Some Love, You Losers. That's the title. So if you ever get a chance to watch that movie, it's really good. So back to Carved. The soundtrack is quite strong here. The mood is solemn. And the character logic is a little better than the average slasher. Not quite as many boneheaded moves. Maybe a few, but not a lot. Now, this was directed by our good friend Koji Shiraishi, who does a solid job, gives us some cool camera shots along the way as well. And please, do not get Carved confused with the nudie flick from 2005 we covered, called The Slit-Mouthed Woman, which is not good. It is a nudie flick that is quite boring. So DVD availability of Carved is that it is widely available. Alright, last film tonight is another one that just isn't well known, and it really slipped through the cracks. This one slipped through the cracks, and it's a South Korean film. And it is called Cadaver, also known as Cut, also known as Anonymous Blood, because every South Korean horror film should have 3 different titles. Medical students are murdered by spirits when performing their study of cadavers. So this begins with a new student who arrives in an elite medical school. she begins a dissection class headed by Dr. Han, along with 5 other students, including her boyfriend. So after the first class, the students all start to share the same nightmare involving a one-eyed surgeon, and one by one, they are murdered, the victims being discovered with their hearts removed. Our protagonist couple is convinced that these events are related to a beautiful cadaver with a rose tattoo on her breast, and they begin an investigation to uncover her identity. So the characters here in this movie and the story are a little bit on the bland side at first, but this film is anchored by good performances and direction. It's deliberately paced and takes itself quite seriously. There are also some good horror sequences that take place in a nearly pitch-black autopsy room at night, where shadows and background noises are used to great effect. Again, sound design in this movie is very good. I recommend that you watch this film in the dark because the lighting at times can be very dim, which in this case actually does enhance the excitement of identifying threats that are barely visible. Lead actress is good, but the finale could have been a little bit better because it feels like a bit of an anticlimax in terms of horror, but it does provide a decent dramatic payoff. This is a good film that somehow slipped through the cracks of the Asian horror DVD boom during the mid-2000s. It inexplicably never got a US DVD release, even though it's the perfect type of film that they like to release back then. So I don't know why this one didn't make it. Kind of an odd thing, but I recommend it. Cadaver. Moderately available on DVD under the various titles that I said. So you might have to look under all 3 titles before finding it. Alright, so that's part 3 of our journey into Asian horror films from 2007. And be sure to join me for part 4, when I will review my personal favorites from this year. So as always, we'll see you next time.